What's up, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Maker Tales, where I'm sharing my maker journey to help you go further in yours. So don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell icon to never miss an opportunity to keep making. In this video, I want to share with you how you can create your own floating shelf. One of my favorite things about this floating shelf design is that it's based off a French Cleat system, which means the shelf is removable and it's really easy to install on other walls. Jumping straight into materials, for this build I'm going to be using 18mm hardwood ply, along with some 20mm thick finished pine for the cleat. The full plans to this build will be available on the Maker Tales website, link is down in the description. While I measure and cut down, I would like to mention one thing. When it comes to the material used for cleats, I would not recommend using OSB or MDF. Try and stick to something a little bit more solid. With everything cut to shape and size, it's time to add some guidelines to make sure we're going into the center of our wood while screwing the shelf together. One of the key things here that you'll see in the design is that we have to leave enough space on the back of the shelf for the cleat. With the lines down, I now add rough marks of where I'm going to be screwing. My plan is to slightly pocket hole these screws as I did for the jewelry bench video. With the pockets done, I'm going to pilot hole all my screws. I do this for the top and bottom and the sides. If you're working with plywood and you don't do this for your sides, there is a high risk of splitting the ply. While doing this, I'll be using clamps, speed squares, and 90-degree clamps to try and keep everything as square as possible. Once I've drilled all the pilot holes, I went ahead and dry mounted the whole shelf together, primarily to check the fitting and to make sure it's square. I did struggle a little bit, as the plywood I was using was offcuts from an older project and the ply had developed a slight bow. Once all together, I gave both the sides and the front face a small sanding to make them all flush. Now that it's all looking good, it's time to take it all apart. I do this to make our life easier to finish the inside before we do the final assembly. Considering I had such a bow in my ply, I only took off the top piece to save myself a little bit of work later on. As I'm working with hardwood ply, it can come with quite a few defects, so I went ahead and filled in all of these with some good wood filler before continuing with the inner part of the shelf. Once the wood filler was dry, I gave it a quick sanding to make it flush to the surface, and then applied some cheap MDF wood sealer. From my previous paint video, I found that this was the most time-effective method for sealing wood for paint. With the sealer dry, it's time to apply a few coats of paint, letting each coat fully dry and then giving it a light sanding with 320 grit sandpaper between each coat. With a total of 3 coats of paint, I had achieved the finish I was looking for. With one last light sanding to get a smooth finish, I then applied 3 coats of polyacrylic. Once again, letting each coat dry and lightly sanding with 320 grit sandpaper between each coat. With the final coat of polyacrylic dried, instead of sanding it with 320 grit sandpaper, I fold the sandpaper on itself and sand the sandpaper itself. So my 320 grit sandpaper turns into a much higher grit. Roughly, I'm guessing around 600 or 1000 grit. I do this as I don't have any higher grit sandpaper. So, using this pseudo high grit sandpaper, I give the last layer of polyacrylic a light sanding to have the inner part of the shelf finished. At this point, we mount the shelf together again. Feel free to use glue this time. Once assembled, it's time to repeat the finishing process, starting with wood filler, sanding the wood filler flush, along with the sides and front if they were no longer flush, a coat of wood sealer, a few coats of paint. This time round though, I found that after my first coat of paint, I could see that I did not do such a great job on the wood filler. So to fix this, instead of sanding the paint away and redoing the wood filler, I used some multi-surface pre-mixed filler which worked a charm. Once dry, I lightly sanded it and finished the painting. Lastly, adding 3 coats of polyacrylic like I did on the inside. Once we get to this point, the majority of the work is done. All that's left is the cleats, which I start by giving them a light sanding to remove the sharp and thin edges. A quick check to see how it fits on the back of the shelf, to then roughly add an adequate amount of countersunk pilot holes for the screws. And then securely screwing the cleat in place. Lastly, let's head over and install our new creation. My plan is to install it right here, above Jenny's desk. As the shelf is going to be so close to the corner of the wall, I use a bit of scrap 18mm ply to get the correct offset. With that done, I now draw some guidelines for the cleat that the shelf is going to rest on. With the aid of these guides, I now place the wall cleat in position, which I first screw straight into the wall with no J-plugs. I do this to correctly position the J-plugs using the screw holes I just made. With the J-plugs in and flush to the wall, I secure the wall cleat into place. Quick tip, don't forget that magic sponges are great for taking pencil marks off walls very easily. And now it's as simple as just placing our new floating shelf into place. And this is only the beginning. You've just hung a floating shelf using the French cleat system. Using that exact same French cleat, you could hang a TV or almost anything. Go and check that video out in the card or on the links down below. A big thanks to my patrons, and if you want to support and enjoy the content that I'm doing here, I would love it if you would consider joining them on Patreon too. Thanks for watching, keep making, and let the quest continue.